Hello, this is a Science Set Free podcast with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Hi, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
Rupert, I wondered today whether we might tackle a person who, in some ways, we've looked at indirectly a few times when we've talked about Christianity, because we're both Christians, both churchgoers, and get a lot from that tradition. But is the person of Jesus? Who do we think Jesus is or was? And I wonder whether an interesting way into this would be to ask what Jesus signifies in the history, the evolution of religions. You know, he appears at a particular point in time, and Christianity makes a lot of the historicity of Christianity, that is definitely something happened at a particular time and place, but that has meaning for us all still now. So to tease out what that meaning might be, and as a sort of starter for 10, I think that I'm increasingly going off the idea, which I think is mainstream in Western churches, that Jesus saves us, to use the common phrase, that somehow Jesus was a sort of sacrifice that appeases God in some way and takes away our sins, therefore. I was reading the other day, actually, that apparently this wasn't such a common idea in the first millennium of Christianity, but that particularly starts to be developed in the second millennium, and then particularly at the Reformation. So the earliest representations of Jesus aren't, for example, the figure of someone on a cross. They're more like a good shepherd in a field or something like that. But what I wonder is whether Jesus and the notion of incarnation particularly is more important, and that, as we've talked about previously actually, that Jesus' significance at a particular moment in history is because of a developing sense of individuality amongst people. So someone like Socrates in the ancient Greek world, we remember as an inspiring individual. But what became a real challenge was how, as individuals, people might experience themselves as connected with the gods, and then when monotheism emerges with God in God's self, and that Jesus becomes such a pivotal figure because Jesus was a person who knew himself both to be fully human, a real individual in our sense, but also as someone who identified with the Logos, with the divine principle in nature, in the cosmos. So the incarnational side of Christianity starts to matter to me a lot more than the soteriological side, the kind of being saved side. And Jesus speaks to me more powerfully in that way. It's a bit like a Buddhist might go into a shrine room and bow to the Buddha because they see in the figure of the Buddha part of themselves that they aspire to nurture and to bring to greater actuality. So too, I think the figure of Jesus speaks to me more as the kind of Christ figure within me, that I aspire, as it were, to be more as Christ was, in the sense of knowing myself as a full individual, but also knowing God in the way that he could call God Father. Something like that.
Well, I think that's very interesting. I think something rather similar. In the Eastern Church, and probably that follows on from the early Church, the main emphasis about Jesus is the principle of theosis, so how humans can become divine. Jesus provides a way in which a human becomes divine, opening way for other humans to become more divine, becoming godlike. It's the deification of humanity. And in Eastern Orthodox churches, you hardly ever see crucifixes. It's usually Christ in glory that's represented in the risen, ascended Christ. And this was brought home to me very clearly when I went to Jerusalem a couple of years ago on a pilgrimage, and the group I was with was taken into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre by the Greek Orthodox Bishop of Jerusalem, who was a friend of the person leading our group. And there we were at the tomb of Jesus, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And he said, you call it the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, we call it the Church of the Resurrection. And so the Western Church emphasizes the death they emphasize the life, the coming to life, this transcended, transformed life of the resurrected Christ. I think that the idea of a saviour is very, very hard to grasp in modern terms, because first of all, most people don't necessarily see that they need saving in the first place. It's rather a stretch to think exactly why do I need, and saving from what. It's possible to understand it, but it's not very easy. It's not natural to most modern people to think that way.
Yeah, I think particularly what's difficult is not the idea that I don't have faults. That's pretty easy to discover of oneself. But it's the idea that a God somehow needs appeasing for these faults. That kind of sacrificial idea. I think that's what it feels.
Yes,
what does it make God out to be?
Well, I think, you see, I've been thinking about this in evolutionary terms. I find looking at religious practices in evolutionary terms is quite helpful. And if you look at this in terms of predator-prey relationships, gods, on the whole, tend to be portrayed as carnivorous predators, eagles, lions, and so forth. And, in the story of Cain and Abel in the Old Testament, Cain is the cultivator of fields and makes an offering to God of crops. Abel is a herder of sheep and makes an offering to God of meat. And God accepts the offering of meat and scorns the offering of vegetables and plants.
That's fascinating.
and then Cain's so jealous of Abel, he kills him. And it's the first fraternity. These are the sons of Adam and Eve. The first one is a herder, the others it's like the agricultural revolution. Basically the story, the Garden of Eden is a hunter-gatherer world. They live in a garden. They're not toiling by digging, they're not digging the land. They're not cultivating the land. The Garden of Eden provides. Admittedly, it's portrayed as a vegetarian Garden of Eden. But then they're driven out of the hunter-gatherer world of living in this primal paradise. And their two sons, one becomes, the two aspects of the Neolithic revolution, one becomes a herder of cattle, a domesticator of cattle, of animals, and the other becomes a cultivator of the ground. And in these early societies, the herders lived a different lifestyle from the cultivators because they moved with their flocks, and the early Jewish patriarchs are all herders, moving with flocks.
Yeah.
And the imagery of Judaism is torn really between these, because after they moved into the Promised Land, then they became agriculturalists, but they're primarily they have flocks of sheep. And Jesus is portrayed as a shepherd, and there's a lot of this imagery of herding. Anyway, one of the things about the animals that are prey animals in relation to predators is that if you have a flock of antelopes and a herd of antelopes in Africa hunted by lions, the lions follow the herd and they pick out the one that's weakest or on the margins or most vulnerable or sick or something. They kill that animal and then they eat it. They've got their dinner. And at that stage, the rest of the herd relax, and many of them just stand around and they can even watch the lions eating that animal, because they know they're not in danger anymore. One has died for the sake of the rest. This is a very, very fundamental pattern in predator-prey relationships. And because predators don't just indiscriminately kill for the sake of killing. I mean, modern foxes might do when they come across a run full of hens, but in the natural conditions, they kill what they need when they need it. And they only need one animal for a meal. So this builds up this thing that the one dies for the sake of the rest. And often the one that dies for the sake of the rest is a young male. In herds of baboons, as they move through dangerous territory, where they can be attacked by hyenas or other predators, very often any baboon that falls behind through injury, they'll struggle desperately to keep up with the others. If they fall behind, they're dead. But the herd, as they move, the young males protect the group by taking up the flank positions. If a predator attacks, the young males will try to fight it off. something like 30% of the young males die protecting the rest of the group. So there's a tremendous attrition of young males in primate societies. So the idea that one dies for the sake of the rest is deeply biological. And so we get this in myths like the dragon threatens the whole society, so the king has to offer his daughter to the dragon, and then St. George comes along and kills the dragon and rescues the daughter. But those stories about every year the dragon has to have this sacrifice, you see, again, is playing into this archetype. And our ancestors were, as Barbara Ehrenreich says in one of her books, Blood Rights, it's a very interesting book, I think, that we've got used to the idea from museum dioramas of man the hunter striding out onto the savannah. But actually, for most of human history, it was much more man the hunted, that humans were pretty defenseless in relation to saber-toothed tigers, lions, leopards, and so forth. And even today, the nightmares of young children are about being chased and devoured by wild animals, even though that's a totally unrealistic fear for a modern urban child. That's what they dream about, and that's what their nightmares are about.
Yeah.
So this pattern of one dying for the sake of the other, O Lamb of God, that takes away the sins of the world, you see, it's built into the Jewish tradition too, because you have the scapegoat, which is sacrificed for the others, and in the story of the Passover, you have the idea that the Paschal lamb is sacrificed to save the Jews, but not the Egyptians. And of course, it goes right back to Abraham and Isaac, where there's a clear substitution of human sacrifice of the son Isaac with animal sacrifice, a ram. So this idea of sacrifice as appeasing potential predators and one dying for the others is very, very archetypal.
So I wonder where the difference is now. You know, is it perhaps that we don't regard ourselves as herd animals so much anymore? Maybe because we value individuality, you know, in a way that so it's still there in our kind of collective consciousness, but that we feel we need a different way of understanding Jesus, because whilst we can feel it there in the past, it maybe isn't so present for us now. Is that how that how would you understand, say, my dis-ease with the idea of sacrifice and one dying for the many, and God as a predator God, and
I think it's still. I think we've still got it with the cult of martyrs. You know that whenever say someone's killed, the people who are killed by terrorists, there's the idea that there but for the grace of God go I, and there's a sense in which they've died for us, and there's a huge outpouring of public grief when this happens.
Yeah.
So I think the archetype is still quite active in our society.
So,
and when martyrs, people are martyred for a cause, it's a very powerful archetype in Islamic terrorism, apart from anything else.
So would a better way of putting it then be to understand that maybe there are different archetypes that could accrue around the figure of Jesus?
Yes.
And one would be the sacrifice archetype, but maybe another one would be more evolution of consciousness kind of archetype.
Yes.
Because as you were talking, actually, another Eastern way of thinking about Jesus came to my mind, not Greek Orthodox, or not Orthodox, but an Indian way of thinking about things. And I remember you introducing me once to the head of what was B. Griffiths' ashram, Father John.
Brother Martin.
Brother Martin, yeah. Thank you, Brother Martin. And his idea that Jesus' life represented different realizations of consciousness, which appealed to me a lot, actually. It felt more incarnational, but I guess would be just using a different kind of archetypal figuration of things.
I think the point is that Jesus becomes the focus of many different archetypes. And, one of them is the Son archetype, the beloved Son, as part of the divine nature, as the kind of as a kind of human form of God. That's a kind of Son archetype, and the relation between Jesus and God seen as a father is one of love, between a parent-child love. Then there's the sacrifice archetype. Then there's the evolutionary archetype, the development of human consciousness, and that's the one that's most in accordance with sort of Eastern type philosophies, because they're about consciousness rising to different levels. And I think one of the other archetypal things is in the Christian message is the conquest of death, because an important part of the Christian view of Jesus is that Jesus opened a pathway through death, through the crucifixion, not in this case seen primarily as a sacrificial, for the sins of the whole world, but as going through death consciously in an extraordinary way, where Jesus was able to pass through death, retain his consciousness, and have a continuity of consciousness which goes beyond death, and which is absorbed into the divine being after death, opens a pathway which we can follow not just through achieving high levels of consciousness while we're alive, but when we die as well, and that he's therefore like a soul guide for us. The Greeks had the idea of psychopomps, or soul guides, and Jesus is like opens the way for our journey after death. And that, I think, is a very key part of the Christian vision.
Yeah, actually, funny enough, I was looking at St. Athanasius's treatise on the incarnation just recently, which is a fantastic read, actually. It's very clear and amazing thing to read. But for him, a big part of the significance of Jesus is Jesus has destroyed death, as he puts it. But I think what you have to understand, what I was grappling with, and what made me think about this, was that I think death at that time wasn't just kind of annihilation, as if you just stopped existing and that was it. Death was a kind of transition into a sort of shadowy half-life.
Yes.
It's very interesting that Hades and Sheol, the Jewish and the Greek words, are more or less interchangeable, even in the New Testament, actually. And there would seem to be a kind of common idea, certainly around the Mediterranean, that to die wasn't to cease to exist, but was to kind of flitter away. And that what, as you're saying, what Athanasius found in the person of Jesus was someone who had gone to Hades, the harrowing of hell, as it's sometimes put, and restored a full life to these souls that were existing in this kind of half-life. Yes. And moreover, it was a resurrected life, a kind of full spiritual life, as well as yes. Everything that we knew in embodied life. And that's a very different notion of resurrection, actually, isn't it? It's not like a conjuring trick with bones, as no. David Jenkins once put it. It really is about moving through life and death into a fuller life.
Yes. And I think that in the ancient world, there was the idea that some people did that. I mean, the idea in Egypt that the pharaohs, after death, through their after-death technology of mummification and so on, they thought that they were projected out to the stars, particularly to the constellation of Orion, and that there was a kind of, they zoomed out of the body, as it were, into the sky. They actually went on a heavenly journey, when ordinary people went down into the earth, but a privileged few zoomed up into the sky. And in a sense, there's one way in which Jesus' death democratizes this heavenly ascent rather than descent into a shadowy underworld, and makes it open to potentially everyone. But the archetype is already there, and of course there's a tremendous interplay of Judaism and Egypt. I mean, after all, they were slaves in Egypt for a long time. Jesus went into Egypt soon after he was born, and part of the story of Jesus' life is that he spent part of his childhood in Egypt. So there's this permeation of Egyptian ideas as well as Sumerian and Babylonian ideas, but the Egyptian ones are quite important, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and I think that it helps us understand the ancient Greek philosophers as well, because I think Plato is a kind of intermediary step in the move from ancient Egyptian ideas to early Christian ideas, because I think what Plato tried to do was to develop what had been a pharaonic practice into a philosopher's practice, because as he puts many times in the dialogues, Socrates says that to philosophize is to learn how to die. This becomes quite a regular trope, actually, throughout the history of Western philosophy. But I think what it meant then was that you would both undergo an experience of death in this life, but but also that you would be awakened to the quality of eternity that surround us as well in this life through various practices. And there's a tradition, and I'm pretty sure it's right as well, actually, that Plato, after the death of Socrates, went to Egypt, experienced what were the Egyptian initiation rites, which by that stage in the history of ancient Egypt had become fairly widespread. As long as you had some means, you could, as it were, undergo what 2,000 or 3,000 years earlier had been just the exclusive right of the pharaoh. But realised that they needed, as it were, remaking for the world in which he lived, 400 or so years before Christ. But then this was an important step, so that when the early Christians come along and think, what on earth has happened with this life, death and resurrection of Jesus, they can rethink it and reconceive it and understand what's been happening. But as you say, it makes it available for all and everybody in the. I think that's probably one of the unique contributions of Christianity. Actually, is that it had made available to everybody what had been a kind of mystical journey that had still been reserved for the relative elite.
Yes.
In say the ancient Greek world.
And I think one other archetype of Jesus, I mean there are probably many others, but one other one that I find particularly important is the social reformer. There's a level at which Jesus can be appreciated and is appreciated by secular humanists. He was an ethical teacher with great ethical teachings that are important for us all and have shaped our entire civilization, even in its secular humanist form. But as an ethical teacher, what Jesus was a kind of figure of a disruptive and rebellious figure. He was someone who went against the official norms of the teachings of the established religion and was a kind of rebel, a heretic, a rebel, a revolutionary in that sense, not a violent revolutionary, but a highly disruptive figure. And I think that's built attention into the whole of Christianity ever since, because there's a sense in which, especially after becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, Christianity becomes an established religion with bishops and cathedrals and churches and hierarchies and all the rest of it, and schools and institutions and stuff. But there's at the core of it is the figure of Jesus, who's a kind of anti-establishment figure. And throughout the whole of human history, the whole of Christian history, there's been a series of anti-establishment movements within Christianity, which can always call upon the example of Jesus. And it puts the official establishment in a very difficult position, because they can't deny that Jesus was an anti-establishment figure. It's so clearly there in the Gospels. But they are now a kind of establishment. And the Franciscans were one of these movements in the Middle Ages. There was a whole series of them. The Protestant Reformation in some ways tapped into this. And there's a lot about Protestantism that looks at that side of Jesus. And I myself, when I'm, as you know, have problems with the science establishment, like anyone like me has problems with their particular establishment, Jesus is a kind of role model of a kind of anti-establishment figure who blazed a completely new trail. And that, again, is a different kind of archetype from all the other ones we've been discussing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It opens up a new charism, a new source of insight and energy and vitality.
Yes.
You remind me as well of what I remember Brother Martin saying, was that if Jesus had gone to India and said that he was God, everyone would have gone, okay, fine, and no one would have batted an eyelid. But if Jesus had gone to India and said everybody's equal, i.e. challenging the old caste system, then he would have really got into trouble. So that seems to be that archetype of Jesus speaking.
Yes, exactly. The Indians would have no problem at all with the idea of Jesus being an avatar of God. The problem the Christian missionaries had when they were trying to evangelize in India was not in persuading Indians that Jesus was an avatar of God. They instantly accepted that. The problem they had was when they said he was the only one. Then they got into real trouble. They said, oh, no, Krishna is there, and Vishnu has many avatars, and Buddha is one, and so on. So this kind of inclusiveness of Hinduism was the problem that the missionaries had.
And I guess that is the historical bit in Christianity, that it very clearly has a sense that God has done something at a particular time that's particularly significant, as it were, a pivotal moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not just a kind of mythic kind of incarnation. It's something in history, and that is, of course, another great part of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which makes it different from all other traditions, really, except perhaps Islam, which is an offshoot of it, which is that that God is acting in history. In other civilizations, God is, in a way, beyond time, and history is cyclical. But the idea that there's a kind of evolutionary process in history, and that this is coming about through a divine interaction with the historical process, is a uniquely Judeo-Christian insight. And it's one which has totally transformed the modern world, because it ultimately, in its secularized form, leads to the idea of progress and evolution. And that's now the standard view of every society in the world. They're all into development, progress. And anyone who's got a smartphone in any part of the world, or who knows about jet planes or realizes we're living in an era that's never happened before. Something really new is happening, that it's not just an eternal recurrence, and almost all antique, archaic models of history were of recurrence. And so Jesus is very much a propelling force of this other archetype of divine interaction with history and us being involved in a historical process.
That's fascinating. So there's a linear archetype of time as well as a cyclical archetype of time.
Yes.
That are brought both into play.
Yes.
Well, that was really fascinating. I hadn't thought when I began my question, who was Jesus, thinking about it in archetypal terms at all, actually. So that's been really illuminating and fascinating as well. Much more flexible, I think, in relation to thinking about our Christian tradition.
I think so, and it means that for different people, different aspects of Jesus become important, but it doesn't mean that the others are wrong. It just means that someone as universally appealing as Jesus, it has these many archetypal roles. And I dare say the historical Jesus would not, as he was going about his daily life in Palestine, was not necessarily thinking consciously about all these archetypes. But I think they're all ways in which we can see Jesus today.
Yeah,
they're all meaningful too.
Yeah, I feel like this is what happens if someone lives fully, but also particularly, that they release all sorts of universal possibilities around them, even though they're living a particular life at a particular time and place as well. Well, look, thanks very much. Maybe that's a good point to finish, and
yes.
I really appreciated that.